Do you want to get started so we can give you some time?
Yeah.
Do you want to start us off and do the recap? So I'm going to start.
Yeah, I can start us off.
Cool.
Okay, so our second class on the Trinity today, and this class in particular is going to be our last class before the break. So no class next week, and the week after we are restarting on January 7th. So it's the first week after New Year's.
Yeah.
Well, I guess first. First Sunday after New Year's when we're starting. Today is part 2 of the Trinity. We're going to go over various different heresies, in particular heresies or different views of Christology, so the nature of Jesus, fully man and fully God. And then also different heresies on the view of the Trinity, who is God actually, how does Jesus and the Holy Spirit fit into that. So I'm going to start us off with prayer, and then we'll go from there. Dear Father, thank you for this day. Thank you for the sermon that we heard today and just how we can realize we don't have to stay still, but at the same time we can always trust and rely on you to provide for us and to really just keep us moving, that there's no such thing as coincidence, right? That you are in control and sovereign over all things. Thank you again for everything that you've provided for us. Pray that we will continue to learn and continue to grow in you and our relationship. We love you, and in Jesus' name, amen.
All right. So I'm going to start us off with Christology. We're going to we went through Orthodoxy last week, and everyone kind of knows that three persons, one essence for Trinity, and then you got 2 persons, one essence for Jesus. Here's our sources. I'm going to be using Systematic Theology by Wayne Grudem for most of it. The history aspect comes from Church History and Plain Language.
Yep.
And then Cal's using Baker's Dispensational Theology. And then, so for the first half, we're going to do Christology. Christology it's not really debated in the church at all anymore, but interestingly enough, I think we all kind of slip into one heresy or the other, just kind of on accident.
That's super easy. Yeah.
Very easy, yeah. Whereas the Trinity is much less easy to slip into heresy, but there are many groups today that just full out accept the old heresies. And, Cal's going to go into some specifically even within Pentecostalism, which is pretty fascinating. So that's kind of the setup. Do you want to recap Trinity?
Sure, yeah. Trinity basic is just that, God is one essence in 3 persons. So when we say that God is one, we mean that in a different way from when we say that God is 3. So we see both of those in the Bible. We see the oneness of God in the Bible, and we see the different persons of God in the Bible. And so how do we reconcile those? Well, we come to this conclusion that God is one in essence, but 3 in person, and those persons are different in relation to each other, but they are all God in attribute.
Right. Perfect. Yeah, very succinct and good there. Christology is that Jesus is 100% man and 100% God. As we talked about last week, the word that they fought over in the First Council of Nicaea, which was kind of establishing what we believed on the Trinity as the church, all lines of Christianity now hold to this, was this word called homoousios, which is consubstantial in English. Famously, Arius, who Cal is going to talk about today, wanted to drop the I and became like homoousos or something like that, and that meant of similar substance. And they thought about it.
Not of same substance, but of similar substance.
Yeah, so specifically that Jesus was a God instead of the God, right? That was thought about, and they ended on homoousios. So we can get into the heresies now.
Cool.
For Christology, so there were 3 main heresies that the early church really fought against in the basically the first through about the 5th century. And then they were all kind of condemned as heresy in the Council of Chalcedon, which was 6 something.
6 something? Okay.
Yeah, I think. I can't really remember. It doesn't really matter. So Apollinarianism.
And then you're saying, in the modern Christian church, no one really seems to hold to these heresies? Okay.
Yeah. So nobody really seems to hold to any of these heresies that I'm going to go through today. Interestingly enough, even one of the heresies, the guy that we named it after, didn't hold to the heresy himself. So they're not really argued against. It's just that people would slip into these pretty consistently. And the early church, they actually taught this. So for an example, like Apollinarius, who Apollinarianism is named after, was actually the bishop of Laodicea in 83 AD. And he basically held that he thought Jesus' body was human, but his human spirit, or he had a human spirit and mind. So for him, it was more philosophical, and they were really early in the church, and they didn't have anything like concrete for us today. For us, it's just so obvious. It's like it's 100% God, 100% man. He was trying to explain it in a way that we could fully understand.
As if like the godness of Jesus has to take away something from the manness of him, right?
Exactly. Yeah. So it's that Jesus' mind. So we read in the Bible that Jesus can. He knows all things, right? He knows who's going to go to heaven, who's going to go to hell, and he has all this omniscience. So it's like, well, that's pretty clear that Jesus doesn't have a human mind. He has a God mind, but then he has a human body because we saw him when he died, right? The issue with that is, well, Jesus grew in his knowledge, right? He was a kid and then he grew up, so
there were some things that he like appeared to not know. For example, like who touched him when the woman touched his garment.
Yep. So there seems to be some sort of difference there, right? And then the main issue with it is that Christ had to be 100% man in order to save man, right? It wouldn't have been just for God to come in and just save us based on his own merit, is what the Reformed would have argued. So that's Apollinarianism. I just went over it really briefly because we don't see it too much today, but it was a huge deal in the first century. So we can go on. Next one. If you don't have any questions on Apollinarianism, pretty easy.
Are there specific reasons why this is not considered the modern view, or
on Apollinarianism? Oh, well, yeah, it's just so easy to argue against, basically, because there's so many examples in the Bible that we can see Jesus as human mind, is essentially what it is.
Sure.
And he was a kid and he didn't know as much, and he had to sit down and learn,
okay.
right? So
Yeah,
he saw this miraculous nature in there as well, as he would teach to the Pharisees at a young age, but it wasn't that, like, it was just his God, the nature on his mind and his spirit, right?
Okay.
So this is Nestorianism. This one is fascinating. Nestorianism is the idea that Jesus. Well, so I'll back up first. I'm going to tell you a little bit of church history story. So I love church history. I think it's fascinating. And in the early church, there were two bishops. There was Nestorius, who was a preacher at Antioch for a while, and then he eventually became the bishop of Constantinople, which was a huge deal to be the bishop of Constantinople. Yeah. Right. He was in
the first megachurch.
Maybe the first megachurch, right? Yeah. So, and in a way, he was branded a heretic, just like many of the megachurches today. So, shots fired. So Nestorius and Cyril were two different bishops, and they were fighting pretty hard over different doctrinal beliefs, right? And specifically, they really hated each other more for political reasons than theological ones. But at the time, if you could brand someone heretic, at best, they were going to be kicked out of the church and never been dealt with again. At worst, you're going to be beheaded, right?
Yeah,
so it's a big deal.
Pretty serious consequences.
Yeah. So.
Oh, also, by the way, if you haven't heard the name Cyril before, he's the one that came up with a lot of the ideas around like the camel going through the eye of a needle type of thing being a. Actually, he came up with the idea of it being a rope going through a needle instead of it being a camel.
Oh, really?
He came up with like a different Greek interpretation on that.
Oh, interesting.
So
yeah, Cyril actually has a lot of issues on his own.
Yeah,
so.
he came up with a lot of things, which is interesting to research. But
yeah, it is interesting. But so specifically for Cyril and Nestorius, is right around the time when the Catholic Church really started to have a high reverence for Mary, and Nestorius hated that. He thought it was a huge deal that we were starting to deify Mary. So he said that Mary was not the mother of God; she was the mother of Jesus, right? Because he's saying, well, God was before Mary, so how can Mary be the mother of God, right? Okay. So Cyril came in and said that's heresy. Like he found its point on him, right? And he said you can't say that he's not the mother of God because Jesus is God. And to separate those two would to say that Jesus has two persons, right?
Yeah.
Or two
so
separate
like
beings.
The idea would be that Jesus was born and then sometime later God indwelt in him.
Exactly. Yeah, that's exactly what it is. So you have two separate persons, a human spirit and a divine spirit, and they came together when he was born, right? So Nestorius would say no, or Cyril said no, that's not the case. He was always the son, right? So the issue with that is that's not actually what Nestorius believed. Nestorius believed was that, hey, like you're deifying Mary by saying that she's the mother of God. And that's 01. They excommunicated Nestorius, and he had to flee the church as a heretic, which is quite sad. But in a way, I think it might have been divine intervention, because Nestorius went and founded one of the largest churches of the early church in like 200 AD in China and Japan. So it's fascinating. But yeah, when the Jesuits went 1,000 years later and went to go bring Christianity to the dynasties there, they found churches. So old churches of the Qin dynasty, which happened another couple hundred years after Nestorius was kicked out, came in and destroyed. So unfortunately, it lasted for about 500 years, I think, that church did. But they full out admitted they were Nestorius churches. And Nestorius himself was not a heretic, right? He didn't hold these views, so it's most likely those were Orthodox churches that lasted for a lot of time that we don't know about.
Yeah, that's crazy.
It's crazy.
It's crazy, especially then because you have the Qing dynasty that comes along, and Buddhism, and right? So
came and just wiped it out. Yeah.
Such an enlightenment.
So, so the church's response to Nestorius was to kick him out. Sorry, I completely skipped over my.
And then he went and did amazing things in China and India.
In China and India.
Maybe God works in mysterious ways, right?
Right. That's kind of what I think. It's kind of unjust that I kicked him out there. But the church's response to the Nestorian heresy, not necessarily what Nestorius believed himself, is that Jesus can't be two separate persons, because he would have referred to himself as we, right? Because Jesus actually does refer to himself as we with the Father, but he doesn't refer to himself as we with himself. So it can't be two separate persons that came together, right? It's just he is the Son. And the Bible never speaks about different persons than Christ.
Also, there would have to be an event that, a very important event about the indwelling of God in Jesus' body that is never recorded.
Right, exactly. Arius kind of tried to get around that a little bit with the transfiguration, but this is specifically talking about when Jesus was first born.
And even before the transfiguration, you have the Magi coming in and worshiping Jesus as God.
Right.
How would that not be just clear idolatry before he's actually God?
Yep. So yeah, some good points there. The next one. So we are moving on to Eutychianism. Eutychianism is a very interesting one, because I think this is our first one that we really start to see in the American church today. So Eutychian?
Yeah, so I do think this actually kind of goes along with the idea of modalism and oneness Pentecostalism.
Oh, that's
a little bit.
Interesting.
I'm not certain, but it feels like if there's going to be a Christology heresy that goes along with a Trinity heresy, it's going to be this one.
Okay. So Eutychianism teaches, and I don't know his name, but it was something like Eutychian or Eutychus or something.
Eutychicus, I think.
Oh, there you go. Eutychus. Eutychus. I'll run with it. No, that's it. You're questioning the teachers here. But what he taught was that the human nature is so much lesser than the divine nature, that when Jesus' divine nature came with his human nature at the virgin birth, it dissolved the human nature like an ink. Yeah, kind of gross, right? He was
destroyed the
human
nature?
Exactly. So he would say,
a virus.
or a parasite. Wait, it's like there's cordyceps, bacteria.
Yeah,
it takes over an insect's brain.
Yeah.
That's kind of, there you go. So it's a little weird one.
That might be the mischaracterization of what he was going for.
He's a heretic. We can talk bad about him. So.
And also he's dead. So.
Yeah, he's dead. All right. So, Troy's will cut that out. Okay, so what he believed, what I know he said, is that if you took a glass of water and you dropped a drop of ink in it, then what you're left with is a third thing. So the ink kind of dissolves in the water, and the water's more kind of takes it over. But he said you have a tertium quid, is what he called it, which means third thing in Latin. And what you're left with is basically like Superman, all right? And this is why it's a really big deal that we fall away from Eutychianism today. I actually had a really long conversation with my younger brother yesterday, because he was saying at his school, people kind of had this over-deified version of Jesus, where he's just like Superman, and he just knew everything, and they really push aside his human nature, all right? That's Eutychianism. It's a very old heresy, but we must make sure when we're viewing Jesus that we hold to that human nature as well. As we talked about last week, when Jesus went back to Bethlehem, people like denied his deity up front. They're just like, there's no way this guy's God. We know it's Jesus.
I knew you from when you were a boy.
Exactly. So that's the major era of Eutychianism that I used to fall into this before I went to Cornerstone. And at Cornerstone, they really beat this one into you too. They're like, hey, don't forget about his human nature.
Gotcha.
Big deal.
Yeah.
So does anyone have questions on those three?
What do you mean by over-deify, though? Because he is fully God.
So he is fully God, but what we do is we often forget about his human nature. So, like, we'll think about him as, I'm going to get into it a little bit later, but, like, did Jesus learn as a kid? You know?
Yeah.
Like, yeah, he did.
And this is kind of one of those things going back. If he was only God, he would not be able to die.
Right. That's another example.
He would not be able to be harmed. He would not be able to be, grieved or taunted. Or, right?
Yeah, or tempted.
Or tempted, yeah.
So I'm going to get into all those in just a sec with the Council of Chalcedon. But before we go to the next page, I wanted to bring up a quick thing about the councils. So the councils were a fascinating part in history. So it's when the whole church comes together and they decided, this is what we believe. In order to stop having all these different bishops teaching different things in the early church.
Like a lot of people want to be like Alexander Hamilton, like I'll go back to the Revolution time where everyone's exchanging letters and creating a new country. No, I want to go back to this.
Put it on the council. Yeah. But just I talked about this last week and I found it this week. So specifically the Council of Nicaea is the first one that we talked about the deity of Christ. Saint Nicholas, as in like Santa Claus, and we have Santa Claus out there. Yeah, Santa. So he was in what?
All the way from Ireland.
Yeah, all the way from Ireland. But he came to the Council of Nicaea, and Arius, who didn't believe that Jesus was fully God, it is said, right? So this is the story behind it, that he stood up during the council and said, Jesus is not God. And that made St. Nick so mad he went up and punched him in the face. And then they had to arrest St. Nick, and then he actually didn't get to be at the rest of the Council of Nicaea. So that's the story. But I found a couple of memes that I just love for it. This one's like my favorite one. It's like, deck the halls, try deck the heretic. Yeah. And here's like Santa with his POV. Those are great. Those are great. So, yeah. Okay. So I'm going to talk about a slightly different council. I do have about 7 minutes here. The Council of Chalcedon was 2 councils after the Council of Nicaea. Right? The Council of Nicaea was about Arianism, which Cal is going to talk about. 2 councils later, they got rid of all these heresies. So basically they had this statement that kind of rejected each of these views. Cal read it last week, so I'm not going to read it this week, but each of the little points that they point out in trying to say what the Trinity is, basically is like a slap in the face of all 3 of these bishops that we just talked about. All right, it's knocking out these heresies and saying, no, Jesus is 100% God, and he is also 100% God. Yeah. So a lot of people really hate on the Chalcedonian Creed because they say it doesn't really say anything about who Jesus is, it just says who he's not. But I don't think that's entirely true, because in a way we can't fully understand who Jesus is because we don't know what it's like to be 100% man and 100% God, right? Mm-hmm. So, but it does bring up some questions. So like one of them would be like, well, how did Jesus grow in knowledge instead of saying, well, but yet be omniscient? So that seems to be a contradiction, right? Does anyone think they know? Just curious how he could like grow in one nature, not the other. You should know this. You took this class. Put you on the spot. That's okay.
I can guess.
The guess, sure.
My guess would be that like God can choose to limit himself in a certain.
So I think we should get our stones because that's a heresy. So.
Oh yeah!
Sorry, no, that actually, you probably remember that from a heresy. It's
Yeah.
actually a limiting heresy. So some people would say, well, God just limited himself as he came in.
Yeah.
I'm not going to get really into that, but it's a slightly different answer that the creeds gave. What the creed said is that it's very important that we recognize both natures of Jesus. All right, we keep them separate and we preserve them. Thus, the language that they would use.
Yeah.
It's really weird.
So as man, he would be limited by his manly nature.
Yep.
And as God, of course, he is his godly nature.
Yeah.
Right. So he is limited by his nature. As
Right.
in he can't sin as
Uh-huh.
God, and of
Mhm.
course he couldn't sin as man. But at the same time, as man, it's not like he could jump 10,000 buildings.
Right. Yeah, because of his
Unless
man nature.
he channeled his miracles
Exactly.
and then
Yeah, I was gonna
So-
say, or walk on water.
Yeah, well,
Okay.
so that's interesting where this starts to interplay, because he is right that you do have to make sure you preserve both of them, and I mean we really do have to make sure we preserve
they're
both
completely
natures.
separate, but they
Exactly.
interact with each other at certain
Exactly.
points.
Well, that would be
They're not
Nestorianism.
completely separate.
So not completely separate, but they're kind of separate.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So this is where this gets really hard, and it's so easy to slip into it. So I'm gonna explain a couple different arguments against the Trinity, and then the answers, or not the Trinity, I'm sorry, Christology, and then the answer to it. And I think we'll kind of get an example better. So how can you be omniscient and grow knowledge? So the important thing that the early church fathers would say is that the property of each nature needs to be preserved here. All right. So another example that they would say that kind of brings us together better would be like, how did or Jesus descended or ascended into heaven and left this world? But if we read Matthew 18:20, it says that where two are gathered in His name, He is also there. So is Jesus in heaven, or is He everywhere? And the answer is actually, well, He's in heaven in His human nature, and He's everywhere in His godly nature, right? So we can kind of see that there is this separation, but it's not Nestorianism. We're not completely breaking it out because it still is Jesus. An interesting part about that, so how about before Jesus was born? Do you guys think that Jesus had two natures, God nature and a man nature? What do you think? We're going to stone you for your oldest time.
Yeah. My brain is telling me God isn't changing, so
Okay.
how could Jesus change?
Well, the answer is no. So He didn't have the human nature before He was born. There's nothing in the Bible that would suggest that. So, sorry, but over to you.
But who knows? He is in heaven now, so presumably he's out of time.
Right.
Like,
So
that's one of a
Someone's
like
gotta participate.
kind of a headcanon idea. Like,
Right.
well, where is Jesus the man now?
Mhm. Yeah. And that they would answer in heaven. The early church would say that. So I was just teasing you. You're actually really good. Thanks,
I know,
Julia.
Christian.
Um,
So I think it's interesting to like talk about Christology, talk about the Trinity, talk about even like what John bringing up free will versus the sovereignty of God.
Mhm.
Like I feel like that God enjoys having these weird, like for us they feel like contradictory, impossible interweavings of things. Do you
Sure.
know what I mean? And I think
Yeah.
that talking about Christology, I appreciate that. Like it is true that we have to remember that that they're both true.
right.
Yeah.
So I explained it like this when I was teaching in Africa. I said, which I think this goes well. Hopefully it's not heresy. But so I said,
That's already,
yeah, Trish's watching me. So like let's say that you were a doctor and you're trying to explain to a kid that he broke his arm, right? He broke his arm and you're saying, well, we're going to put a cast on it and in 6 months it's going to be healed, right? That's a true statement. That is true. But with all the knowledge that the doctor has, he's also going to know all the cellular biology and everything that goes along to make that process happen, right? But by him explaining it to the kid in simple terms that he'd understand is not lying, right? It's true. But the kid does not have the experience
Right.
to possibly know what the doctor knows. Right? So kind of in the same way,
right.
we're just so much lesser than God and we
But
can't
we
experience
cannot-
what it's like.
Yeah.
Yeah, so he's not lying to us. And specifically, he's not contradicting himself.
Right.
So people will say, well, this doesn't make any sense. How can you have two persons in one essence? And the answer is, well, those aren't the same thing. Two persons in one essence isn't the same thing. If you can't understand it, that doesn't make it not true.
Or have you ever heard of left brain and right brain?
Yeah, yeah, right. So,
Um,
yeah, the concept of it in psychology, that's
Yeah.
another good way to think about it too. So then what we come down to, so we have the preservation of both these persons. Do you guys think that means that Jesus has different wills? Julia? Yes or no?
Yes.
Yes, got it. So the monophysites, okay, that word.
that word.
They were heretics in the early church that said he had one will. The issue with this is that, well, if he was tempted in the wilderness and God can't be tempted, how is that possible that the same will was either tempted or not tempted, right? That would be a contradiction. It can't happen. So Jesus was tempted in his human nature. He was not tempted in his deity, right? Or when he was tired on the cross, how can an omniscient or omnipotent God get tired, right? He was tired in his human nature. He was not tired in his deity. And then when he died, right? So he died in his human nature. He did not die in his deity. It's impossible for God to die, right? So this is how we can preserve both his two separate persons and one essence, as to describe it as the will, right? Jesus has two wills. It's the same way Jesus says, not my will, but yours be done. He's in the Garden of Gethsemane. He really didn't want to die in his human nature,
Right.
but in his deity, he knew he needed to die, right?
And of course, if you say he only has one will, then he's not really fully human.
Right.
Yeah, that's
in
another
his
way to
human
think about
nature,
it.
right? So
100%.
What a wonderful example of him when he's in the Garden of Gethsemane. Like, he didn't want to die. His humanness didn't want to die on the cross.
Yeah.
And he asked for a way out.
Right.
Like, that's so practical for ourselves when it's like, I really do want your will, Lord, more than mine. But I'm going to ask you, I'm going to pray
Right.
that X will happen. But if your will is Y, then I'd rather have your will than my will.
Mhm.
yeah. And as far as temptation goes, I think it's a really cool idea that, yeah, Jesus had a human nature and a human will
Mhm.
that was being tempted, but at the same time, his godly nature comes in and just like arm
Yeah,
ourselves,
wins.
right?
Yeah.
The same way that we can rely on the Spirit inside of us.
Exactly.
Right.
The same.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
So you're leading right up to a good point. So people will often say, well, again, contradiction, this doesn't make sense. But so Grudem brings up a good point. He says, well, what about a runner running a race? Like, everything in his body is telling him that you should not finish this out, right? But he's going to overpower that will, and he's going to win the race,
Yeah.
right? So there's a good example of how we might even seem to have two wills within our own person. And then lastly, just one quick thing that I know we just really focused on the separation of the two wills, but it's very important that we say we recognize Jesus as one person, because that's how Jesus recognizes himself. And this is also not wrong, because like, let's say when I was writing these notes, I would say when I wrote these notes, right? I would not say when I wrote these notes with my fingers but not my toes, because those are both attributes of me, right? So would I ever say I didn't write these notes with my toes, or would I just say I wrote these notes, right? You guys understand kind of what I'm saying here?
Yeah.
So when Jesus says I did something, that includes both natures.
And if you're not going to make a natural distinction, like, why make any distinctions, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Why not say, like, well, actually, the book that I read wrote these notes for me through the use of
Right.
my mind and my hands. right?
Uh-huh. Yeah, it's just not, yeah, it doesn't make sense.
Exactly.
So I'm going to skip Gnosticism just for the sake of time.
Yeah, so we get into some of the Trinitarian heresies. So probably the most well-known one and more prevalent, yeah, maybe more prevalent today,
Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
is the heresy of Arianism.
Mhm.
So this is a heresy that is actually, practiced, taught by Jehovah's Witnesses, and then a couple other ones, like there's a Spanish church.
Iglesia ni Cristo.
Yeah.
That one.
Yeah, that one. And the idea is pretty simple. It's that Jesus was the first created being through the whole universe, and then everything else was created through him. And so this is based, seemingly based almost entirely on the idea presented to us in Colossians 1:15, which says, "The Son is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn over all creation." And so, okay, well, what is our answer here, right? Firstborn sounds pretty clear, but the reality is this is talking about a title of inheritance, not necessarily a act of having been born. And there's a big difference, right? So when we're talking about inheritance, you don't actually have to be the firstborn to
Yeah.
inherit. Like,
Yeah, Jacob and Esau.
yeah,
Mhm.
for example, Jacob and Esau, or in the case of like a parent inheriting possessions from their child, right? You are still their heir on a technicality, not necessarily how we would prefer things to be, right? In that particular sense.
Did
So
Jehovah's Witness say that when Christ was physically born, that was when he was created, or would they say he was created?
no,
before
so
the-
they would
That's
say
an
he was
interesting one.
created before everything as spirit, and then in the incarnation, his spirit indwelled in the body.
Yeah. That's
which
why
is
he's like a lesser God.
yeah, and so of sorts this would make Jesus a lesser God,
Mhm.
which we know just from how Jesus is also described that is not possible, right? It's not possible for Jesus to be all-knowing and also have been created after God, right? If he was created after God, there would be just naturally be some things that he could not possibly know. Or to be all-powerful, if he was created, he cannot be created and then given all power. It just doesn't make sense.
Yeah.
So
That's true.
and yeah, so also some context in Colossians 1. In verse 16, it says, I don't actually have it written here. I'll just say my argument from that. In verse 16, I say Jesus could not have been created if all things were created through him, right? That's just a simple contradiction. And then it's just obvious. And then verse 18, Jesus is also the firstborn from among the dead. So does that mean Jesus was also the first to die? So he was like created and then died, and then everything was created through him, and then he became incarnate and then also died. Like, it doesn't make sense.
Right.
This is clearly talking about a title of inheritance or importance, right?
Right.
He was the most important to die.
Mm-hmm.
So obviously no. And yeah, so that's that. Are there any questions about Arianism? It's a pretty basic one. People who hold to this will tend to appeal to a couple different verses, or like the Jehovah's Witness will say like, oh, well, Jesus said the Father is greater than I.
Mm-hmm.
But that is out of context.
Yeah.
Literally in the same chapter, he goes on to claim many things that would make him equivalent to God.
Yeah. Yeah. Well,
So-
also to say that he's greater than him could just mean that he holds a higher position over him.
Exactly.
Which is
Exactly.
certainly true.
Which, yeah, and that goes to Jesus' character as the humble servant.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Submitting to the God or to the Father in the Garden of Gethsemane.
Yep.
An interesting thing about Arianism, though, I actually met the Lyrios, so Tony's mom. She was raised Christian, so she wasn't Jehovah's Witness, but they were self-proclaimed Arians. So they literally said, we follow the teachings of Arius. So
Interesting.
It is interesting, but like we were saying before, nobody really comes around and says, I'm an historian, right? But people do say that about Chalcedons here.
Yeah, and a lot of times they'll say, well, Jesus is God, just not as great as God the
Yeah.
Father, or something along those lines.
Mhm.
Are Mormons kind of similar?
Mormons are different. We'll
Yeah.
get to them a little bit later. Sabellianism or Oneness Pentecostalism, also known as modalism, they're both forms of modalism, is the idea that God is one in essence and person. So there's only one person in the Godhead, I guess, so it wouldn't either be Godhead, just be God. And that he then, throughout time, puts on different forms to interact in ways that would maybe be most effective.
Different hats.
Yeah, the idea is like different hats or different masks throughout time, which
Divine
is
shapeshifter.
yeah, divine shapeshifter. Yeah. Some examples of this are the United Pentecostal Church International and the Apostolic Assemblies of Christ. So they are both Oneness Pentecostal movements. And
I wonder why that's attractive to the Pentecostals. Do you know?
I'm not exactly certain why it's attractive. I do know the main arguments that they rely upon come from the Old Testament, that like Isaiah and Deuteronomy like 6:4, for example, reiterate that the Lord is one. And so they overemphasize that aspect and then read that into the personhood of the Trinity, and then you come away with that like, well, it's only Jesus. There's only Jesus.
Right. And you
That's
kinda
kind
have-
of what Oneness Pentecostals would say. It's like,
So
it's
do
only
they
Jesus.
deny the Holy Spirit then?
Yeah, kind of. So they would say
That's
that the
interesting.
Spirit is not a separate person, rather is just the Spirit emanating from Jesus or from God.
Maybe like in the same
Right.
way, like our spirit.
Yeah, in the same, exactly.
Like,
So.
so he just sends out a wave of an essence?
Of essence or energy.
But it's not actually him.
Correct.
Okay. That's,
Yeah.
Yeah. And yeah, of course, that is kind of an interesting idea. Like, well, if it is just his Spirit, then Christ doesn't really dwell in us.
Yeah. Right.
There's a, so anyway.
Right.
Of course, our answer to that is that God, Jesus, and the Holy Spirit, or like the Father, are not simply other names for the same exact thing. We are referring to different people, even though they have the same essence. We're referring to different persons. So they are separate persons who have all existed eternally, Examples in Scripture, John 1:1, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God.
Yeah, what do they say about that?
So you have to just have a wrong interpretation. You have to either say, kind of ignore the second part of that verse where it says the Word was with God, and just be like, well, really it's just saying the same thing as the Word was God. But that's not, like, why would it be written down?
Yeah, why would you say it twice?
Exactly.
That's why it's so hard to comprehend the Trinity, I mean, because they're separate and they're one at the same time.
Yeah, so that's a great point.
Exactly. It is difficult to comprehend, and that is the thing that
So
we
you
need
kind of
to...
see where it's very easy, you just take a little bit of a turn, you can end
Yeah.
up a lot different, but you can kind of understand the thought process.
So did you notice all of mine too that I taught were all very easy to understand? But the Trinity is not
Yeah.
easy to understand. Right?
And this is kind of one of the principles that we have is if there's anything that's if there's anything that we are not able to understand,
Yeah.
it is God and His divine nature, right?
Right,
He
right.
existed before everything was created.
Mhm.
He has attributes that are not able to be completely understood by us.
Mhm.
We can see a sort of shadow, right?
Right.
But-
That's what Paul says.
Yeah, but we can't actually see the full picture.
Mhm.
Just
We
like
can,
John's little graph that he had
Yeah.
today.
yeah. Conceptually, right, if God was a sphere and we are just viewing him from one perspective, we would actually have to be greater than God and view him from all around.
Yeah.
in
How
order to
great
see all
would God be if we could understand?
Exactly,
That? Yeah.
exactly. So, yeah,
Cool.
and
Good stuff.
yep. So Matthew 28:19, right? Jesus says, "Therefore go and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit." Well, why would Jesus use 3 different names at the same time? Why not just say, "Baptize them in my name" or "Baptize them in the name of God" if they're all the same? And then John 8:16, "But if I do judge, my actions are true because I am not alone. I stand with the Father who sent me." Jesus does not stand alone, but with the Father. If he, how can he do that if he's not a separate person?
Right.
In this context, he uses the title of Father to give us the idea of a person who's separate from him, right? He never refers to himself as the Father. He always says, "I and the Father are one," but he never says, "I am the Father."
Right.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right? It's one of those weird things, right?
So-
Where he himself makes a distinction between the oneness of God and the threeness of God.
Right. So, actually, on our first week back on the 7th or whatever, we're actually just going to get some stones and go to the Pentecostal church.
but not. So to be clear, this is not all Pentecostal churches.
Right.
This is specifically Pentecostal
I
churches
don't know where he came
that
from.
have that.
Those
Yeah.
are all
stuff.
over America,
That,
right?
that's a very good
Yeah.
distinction,
So
yeah.
some of these do have many members, like
Yeah.
millions of members.
But it's a small portion. Of
It is
the
a small
church.
portion of Pentecostal churches
Yeah.
at large, and then of greater churches at large, right?
Yeah, I know where there's an
So-
apostolic church down the road.
Yeah. I got a lot of friends in the Pentecostal church, and they believe in the Trinity. So.
So. Yeah.
Yeah.
And then you have the most heretical of all of them, which is tritheism.
Mhm.
So it really kind of comes down to Jesus is not as God.
Mhm.
God is one in person and essence, and then tritheism, which is there's actually just 3 separate gods
Mhm.
who are all equally powerful. Is
That's
the
what
idea.
Jehovah's Witnesses think that we all believe, though.
Yes.
Yes, so that's
Right.
what they would claim we all believe,
Yeah.
but that's not
I have
what
a
we all
very
believe.
hard time understanding that what
But-
we believe is
yeah.
different from this.
But again,
Yeah, so this is one of those things where if that's the case, then Paul is also tritheist. Peter is also tritheist because they worship Jesus Christ
Yep.
as God.
Mm-hmm.
All the Magi are
yeah, tritheism.
exactly. So it doesn't. There's no way around it around the Trinity.
Yep.
So in this case, they would say God is 3 different persons in 3 different essences. Examples of this are Mormons, and actually, like the Hindus have a sort of tritheistic God as well. I didn't look too far into that.
Yeah. I think they have a little more than 3.
Because obviously they don't use any biblical sources
Yeah.
as the basis
3
for
of the
this.
main, there's a lot more than
Oh, yeah,
3,
you'll
but
know
the
this.
3 of the main gods is kind of like their Trinity.
Gotcha. Okay.
Yeah, Vishnu, things like that.
Yeah, that's right. Our answer to this is, well, it just denies the very, very, very plain language of the Old Testament and, in fact, the New Testament. Deuteronomy 6:4, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one." Isaiah 45:5, "I am the Lord, and there is no other. Apart from me, there is no God. I will strengthen you, though you have not acknowledged me." And then 1 Corinthians 8:4-6. "So then, about eating food sacrificed to idols, we know that an idol is nothing at all in the world, and that there is no God but one," etc. So it is very, very clear, and so it's not common among most Christian denominations. Really, the only one is Mormonism that would hold to this.
Yeah, those
And the reason why they hold to this is because they accept extra biblical sources.
Right.
Yeah.
Right?
We
So
talked
the
about
only
that.
places that really do accept this are ones that believe that there is more to the Bible than what we have,
Yeah.
or either that or they know pretty much nothing about what the Bible says.
What's fascinating about these specifically, the tritheism, modalism, and Arianism, is that all of those were first century debates as well. So when we see the heresies today,
Yeah.
they're not any different than what
They're
we've been
not.
fighting for 2,000 years. So,
Yeah.
They just come in different names. We just call them Mormons now.
Exactly. I mean, well, like for example, the Muslims added the Quran to the Bible, and while they're not tritheist
Mhm.
necessarily, they do come away with an improper understanding
Yep.
of who God is
Yep.
and His nature. So.
Mhm.
Yeah, and that's about it. So here's the general defense of the Trinity that I promised. This is a really, really beefy slide, and I don't have extra notes for it.
Mhm.
So the idea is you basically just like take a photo or a screenshot or watch it online and go to all of these references and go through the argument and
If you ever need to talk to a Mormon, this is your slide.
yeah, or a Jehovah's Witness or Oneness, Pentecostal, anyone who refutes the personhood and the Trinity. There's tons of stuff, and there's just tons more besides this even,
Mhm.
as far as scriptural evidence for particularly who Jesus is and Jesus's divinity are by far the strongest. Well, apart from the Father,
Mhm.
everyone just kind of
Yeah,
it's like
not much
okay,
argument.
it's your base. Yeah, it's the base from which your argument stands. So
Mhm.
yeah.
Cool. That's our last bell.
Yeah. So
Next classes.
next class we start again on January 7th, and we
Yay.
are going to be talking about how do we talk to Muslims?
Mhm.
Yeah. How do we evangelize Muslims? And then specifically from an apologetic standpoint, what are Islamic arguments against Christianity, and then what are our responses to that or arguments against
Mhm.
Islam?
Yeah, we really enjoyed when we did Mormons and Jehovah's Witnesses. We thought we'd take it on from a different perspective too. So
Yeah. And there's more sources as far as this online than there are for Jehovah's Witnesses or
Right.
Mormons, because everyone's like, well, they're like close enough to Christians, you don't have to
Right.
really fight them.
But here it's like, okay.
But they're so well educated in their non-biblical sources that you really have to know what you're talking about.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's true.
That's
Yeah.
100%
That's the hard
true.
part.
Yeah, and so actually, I think what we will find the most effective means are actually looking at what their scriptures say
Yeah.
specifically about Christianity,
Mhm.
and then what their conclusions must be from that.
Mm-hmm.
And oftentimes Muslims don't even know that themselves. So
No,
Cool.
it's true.
Yeah, I'm excited for that one. That'll be fun. So there's our teas. Come back in 2 weeks.
yeah, cool. Thank you.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks, you guys.